deep in the mist-shrouded valleys of western Massachusetts, where the Berkshire Mountains roll like sleeping giants beneath perpetual fog, there stands a monument that local historians prefer to forget. The weathered granite obelisk rises 30 feet from a barren circle of earth, its surface scarred by decades of harsh New England winters. No grass grows within 50 yards of its base. No birds nest in the gnarled oak trees that surround it. The soil itself seems to reject life, as if the very ground remembers what transpired here. The inscription, barely legible after more than a century of neglect, reads simply, "In memory of the daughters who never were." Below this cryptic epitaph, 17 names are carved in descending order, each bearing the same surname, Winslow. Sarah Winslow, 1847. Margaret Winslow, 1849. Elizabeth Winslow, 1851. The dates continue in this peculiar pattern, always 2 years apart, always ending before a wedding that never came to pass. The monument stands in what was once the heart of Millbrook, Massachusetts, a prosperous textile town that thrived during the mid-19th century. Today, only foundations remain, overgrown with thorny vines and poison ivy. The state records list Millbrook as abandoned following economic decline, circa 1870. But the truth, buried in private correspondence and sealed church records, tells a far more disturbing story. This is the story of the Winslow Curse, a tale of systematic horror that claimed 17 young women across 2 generations. It is a story of a family's growing madness, a community's willful blindness, and an evil that fed on the most sacred of human bonds. The year was 1847, and America was experiencing unprecedented growth. The Industrial Revolution had transformed New England from a collection of farming communities into the manufacturing heart of a young nation. Millbrook, nestled in a valley blessed with swift-running streams and abundant timber, had become a model of progress. The Winslow textile mill employed nearly 300 workers, its red brick buildings stretching along the Millbrook River like a monument to human ingenuity. At the center of this prosperity stood Jeremiah Winslow, a man whose very presence seemed to command both respect and unease. Standing 6 feet tall, in an era when most men barely reached 5.5 feet, Winslow possessed the kind of imposing physicality that made others instinctively step aside when he passed. Described by contemporaries as the color of winter ice, held a penetrating intelligence that seemed to see through pretense and deception. His voice, when he chose to speak, carried the weight of absolute authority. Winslow had arrived in Millbrook in 1840, the capital enough to purchase the failing grist mill and transform it into a textile operation. Within 5 years, he had built an empire that extended far beyond the valley. His fabrics were sold in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. His workers enjoyed higher wages than their counterparts in other mills. His innovations in machinery and production methods were studied and copied throughout New England. But it was not Jeremiah's business acumen that made him the most powerful man in Millbrook. It was his ability to solve problems that others found insurmountable. When a worker was injured and faced destitution, Winslow would quietly arrange for medical care and continued wages. When a family fell behind on rent, he would speak privately with the landlord, and the debt would mysteriously disappear. When the town needed funds for a new school or church improvement, Winslow would make a generous donation, asking only that his contribution remain anonymous. The people of Millbrook came to see Jeremiah Winslow as more than just an employer or benefactor. He was their protector, their guardian angel, the man who stood between them and the harsh realities of industrial life. They trusted him with their livelihoods, their futures, and ultimately, their daughters. Sarah Winslow was 17 when she became engaged to Thomas Blackwood, the son of a prominent Boston merchant family. The engagement was announced in the spring of 1847 with great fanfare. The wedding was planned for September, and the entire town was invited to celebrate. Sarah was everything a young woman of her station should be: beautiful, accomplished, devoted to her family and community. She played piano with skill that impressed visiting dignitaries. spoke French with a perfect accent, and managed her father's household with efficiency that belied her years. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Sarah threw herself into preparations with the enthusiasm of a young woman about to embark on the greatest adventure of her life. She spent hours with the seamstress, perfecting every detail of her wedding dress. She planned the menu for the reception with the cook, ensuring that every guest would remember the finest meal of their lives. She wrote letters to distant relatives, inviting them to share in her joy. But those who knew Sarah best began to notice subtle changes in her behavior as the wedding date approached. Mary Hennessy, who had served as the Winslow family's housekeeper for nearly a decade, later told her priest that Sarah had begun experiencing what she called strange dreams. In the final weeks before the ceremony, these dreams, according to Mary's confession, involved visions of a vast underground chamber filled with women in wedding dresses, all of whom looked exactly like Sarah herself. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, the town's physician, noted in his private journal that Sarah had consulted him about episodes of disorientation that seemed to worsen as September approached. She would lose hours at a time, finding herself in locations with no memory of how she had arrived there. Once, she was discovered standing in the mill's main production floor at 3 a.m, still wearing her nightgown, staring at the massive looms with an expression that Dr. Hartwell described as profoundly disturbed. The Reverend Augustus Whitmore, pastor of Millbrook's First Congregational Church, recorded in his sermon notes that Sarah had requested private counseling sessions to discuss what she termed spiritual concerns about her upcoming marriage. According to Whitmore's carefully coded language, Sarah had expressed fear that she was being called to a different purpose, that her marriage might represent a betrayal of sacred obligations. On the morning of September 15, 1847, 3 days before her scheduled wedding, Sarah Winslow vanished without a trace. The circumstances of her disappearance defied explanation. Sarah had retired to her room at the usual hour, bidding good night. To her family with apparent normalcy, her maid, Agnes Murphy, had helped her prepare for bed and had locked the bedroom door from the inside, as was customary for unmarried women of Sarah's social standing. The windows were secured with iron bars, a precaution Jeremiah had installed after a series of break-ins at neighboring properties. When Agnes arrived the next morning to wake her mistress, she found the room empty. The bed had been slept in, but Sarah was gone. Her nightgown lay folded at the foot of the bed. Her wedding dress, which had been hanging in the wardrobe, was missing. The door remained locked from the inside. The windows were undisturbed. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of forced entry, no evidence of any kind to explain how a young woman could simply vanish from a secured room. The investigation that followed was thorough but ultimately futile. Sheriff William Crane, a man known for his methodical approach to law enforcement, spent weeks interviewing every person who had contact with Sarah in the days before her disappearance. He examined the room with the care of a scientist, cataloging every detail, searching for any clue that might explain the impossible. Thomas Blackwood, the devastated fiancés, hired private investigators from Boston to supplement the local search efforts. They combed the surrounding countryside, dragged the mill ponds, questioned travelers and transients. They offered substantial rewards for any information about Sarah's whereabouts. They followed every lead, no matter how unlikely or bizarre. The search efforts revealed nothing. Sarah Winslow had disappeared as completely as if she had never existed. The only trace of her passing was the empty room and the grief of those who loved her. Jeremiah Winslow's response to his daughter's disappearance was characteristic of the man's extraordinary self-control. He continued to operate the mill with his usual efficiency, attended community meetings, fulfilled his social obligations. But those who knew him well noticed subtle changes. His already sparse conversation became even more economical. His penetrating gaze seemed to turn inward, as if he were contemplating mysteries that others could not fathom. He began spending long hours alone in his study, emerging only for meals and business necessities. The official investigation was quietly closed after 6 months. Sheriff Crane's final report, preserved in the county archives, concluded that Sarah had likely eloped with an unknown suitor, abandoning her engagement to Thomas Blackwood in favor of a more passionate romance. This explanation satisfied no one who had known Sarah, but it provided a comfortable fiction that allowed the community to move forward without confronting the disturbing implications of a more thorough investigation. Thomas Blackwood left Millbrook immediately after the investigation concluded. Margaret Winslow, Sarah's younger sister, had grown from a precocious child into a young woman of remarkable beauty and intelligence. Where Sarah had been gentle and contemplative, Margaret was vivacious and outgoing. She had inherited her father's commanding presence and her mother's artistic sensibility, creating a personality that seemed to illuminate any room she entered. Margaret's engagement to Jonathan Prescott, heir to a shipping fortune, was announced in the spring of 1849. The match was considered even more advantageous than Sarah's had been, uniting two of New England's most prominent families in a union that promised to strengthen both their business interests and social standing. The engagement celebration was deliberately modest, a reflection of the family's lingering grief over Sarah's disappearance. But as the wedding date approached, Margaret threw herself into preparations with an energy that seemed to surprise even those who knew her well. She commissioned a dress that was said to be even more elaborate than Sarah's had been, worked with architects to plan extensive renovations to the Prescott family estate, and organized a honeymoon tour of Europe that would last nearly a year. But as September 1849 approached, Margaret began to exhibit the same troubling behaviors that had preceded Sarah's disappearance. The dreams, the disorientation, the mysterious consultations with Dr. Hartwell and Reverend Whitmore. Agnes Murphy, who had remained with the family despite the trauma of Sarah's disappearance, confided to her sister that Margaret had begun speaking in her sleep, carrying on conversations with someone who was not there. The housekeeper, Mary Hennessy, noted that Margaret had developed a habit of walking through the house at night, moving with the purposeful stride of someone following a specific route. When questioned about these nocturnal wanderings, Margaret would claim no memory of leaving her room. On September 12, 1849, exactly 2 years and 3 days after Sarah's disappearance, Margaret Winslow vanished under circumstances that were identical in every detail to her sister's fate. The same locked room, the same undisturbed windows, same folded nightgown and missing wedding dress. The same complete absence of any evidence that might explain how a young woman could simply cease to exist. This time, however, the investigation was perfunctory. Sheriff Crane, who had aged visibly in the 2 years since Sarah's disappearance, spent only a few days examining the scene before concluding that Margaret had likely suffered the same fate as her sister. The private investigators hired by the Prescott family reached the same conclusion after a brief investigation. The official report suggested that both sisters had been victims of the same unknown abductor, possibly someone who had been watching the family and waiting for opportunities to strike. This explanation required accepting that a predator had somehow discovered a method of entering locked rooms without leaving any trace. But it was preferable to the alternatives that more imaginative minds might consider. Jonathan Prescott, unlike Thomas Blackwood, did not accept his fiancée's disappearance with quiet resignation. He established a private investigative agency dedicated exclusively to finding Margaret and Sarah, offering rewards that eventually totaled more than $50,000. He purchased property in Millbrook and took up residence there, becoming a fixture in the community as he pursued his obsessive quest for answers. Prescott's investigation was far more thorough than any official effort had been. He interviewed every person who had ever worked for the Winslow family, examined every document in the town's archives, studied the mill's employee records going back to its founding. He hired geologists to examine the foundations of the Winslow house, employed mediums and spiritualists to conduct seances, consulted with experts in criminal psychology and forensic science. His efforts revealed disturbing patterns that previous investigations had missed or ignored. Multiple witnesses reported seeing young women in wedding dresses walking through the town in the hours before dawn, always moving in the direction of the mill. These sightings were dismissed as hallucinations or dreams by local authorities. But Prescott documented 17 separate incidents over the course of his investigation. More significantly, Prescott discovered that the Winslow family's prosperity was built on a foundation of carefully concealed tragedies. Employment records showed that the mill had experienced an unusually high number of workplace accidents, always involving young women who had recently become engaged. These accidents were typically attributed to carelessness or equipment failure, but Prescott found patterns that suggested a more sinister explanation. The mill's machinery, Prescott learned, had been modified in ways that served no apparent industrial purpose. Hidden chambers had been constructed beneath the main production floor, accessible only through concealed passages that were not shown on any architectural plans. These chambers contained equipment that had no obvious connection to textile production, devices that seemed designed for purposes that Prescott could not identify. Most disturbing of all, Prescott discovered that Jeremiah Winslow had been collecting personal items from young women throughout the valley for years before Sarah's disappearance: hair ribbons, pieces of jewelry, scraps of fabric from dresses. These items were carefully cataloged and stored in the hidden chambers beneath the mill. The collection included items that belonged to women who had died in mill accidents, women who had moved away from the valley, and women who had simply vanished without explanation. Prescott's investigation was cut short when he was found dead in his hotel room on September 10, 1851, 2 days before the 3rd anniversary of Margaret's disappearance. The coroner ruled his death a suicide, noting that Prescott had been drinking heavily and had left several letters expressing despair over his inability to find his missing fiancée. But the hotel staff reported that Prescott had been in good spirits the evening before his death, excitedly telling anyone who would listen that he had finally discovered the truth about the Winslow family. The letters attributed to Prescott were written in a handwriting that experts later determined could not be positively identified as his own. Elizabeth Winslow, the youngest of Jeremiah's daughters, had watched her sisters disappear with the stoic acceptance of a young woman who had been raised to understand that life was filled with inexplicable tragedies. She had inherited her father's intellectual curiosity and her mother's artistic talents, but she had also developed a wariness that seemed unusual in someone so young. Elizabeth's engagement to Charles Whitmore, the son of Reverend Augustus Whitmore, was announced in the spring of 1851. The match was considered appropriate rather than advantageous, uniting two prominent local families without the broader social implications of her sister's engagements. Charles was a serious young man, studying for the ministry under his father's guidance, and Elizabeth seemed genuinely devoted to him. But Elizabeth's preparations for marriage were markedly different from her sister's. She insisted on a simple ceremony, refused to commission an elaborate dress, and expressed preference for a brief honeymoon in the immediate vicinity rather than an extended tour. Most significantly, she requested that the wedding be moved from September to June, breaking with family tradition for reasons she would not explain. Jeremiah Winslow's response to his daughter's requests was uncharacteristic. The man who had always indulged his daughter's wishes became inflexible when it came to wedding arrangements. The ceremony would be held in September, as tradition demanded. The dress would be made by the same seamstress who had created Sarah's and Margaret's gowns. The honeymoon would be postponed until after the harvest season. Jeremiah's business obligations would allow him to spare his attention. Elizabeth's resistance to her father's demands grew stronger as the wedding date approached. She began making preparations to elope with Charles, arranging for a carriage to take them to Boston, where they could be married immediately. She confided in Agnes Murphy, who had remained with the family despite the trauma of witnessing to mysterious disappearances, that she feared the same fate that had befallen her sisters. Agnes later testified that Elizabeth had become convinced that her father was somehow responsible for Sarah's and Margaret's disappearances. She had begun avoiding being alone with him, insisted on having her meals brought to her room, and had started sleeping with a chair wedged against her door despite the fact that it locked from the inside. The elopement was planned for September 10, 1851, the same date that Jonathan Prescott had been found dead. Elizabeth had arranged to meet Charles at the mill just after midnight, when the night shift would provide cover for their escape. She had packed a small bag with essential items, and had sewn her mother's jewelry into the lining of her traveling dress. Charles Whitmore waited at the appointed meeting place until dawn, but Elizabeth never appeared. When he finally returned to the Winslow house, he found that she had vanished in the same manner as her sisters. Locked room, undisturbed windows, folded nightgown, missing wedding dress. This time, there was a difference. Elizabeth had managed to leave a message. Hidden beneath her mattress, Agnes Murphy discovered a letter addressed to Charles in Elizabeth's handwriting. The letter, which was immediately confiscated by Sheriff Crane and never made public, reportedly contained accusations against Jeremiah Winslow and descriptions of activities that the sheriff deemed too disturbing for public consumption. Charles Whitmore denied access to his fiancée's final message, suffered what contemporary accounts describe as a complete mental breakdown. He abandoned his ministerial studies, left Millbrook, and spent the remainder of his life in a private sanitarium in New York State. He died in 1889, the same year as Thomas Blackwood, and his medical records were sealed by court order. The investigation into Elizabeth's disappearance was even more cursory than those that had preceded it. Sheriff Crane announced that he had found evidence linking all 3 disappearances to a criminal organization that had been operating in the region for several years. He claimed that the organization had been disbanded and its members arrested, but no records of these arrests have ever been found. The official explanation satisfied no one, but by this time, the people of Millbrook had developed a collective determination to avoid confronting the growing horror in their midst. They had accepted that the Winslow family was somehow cursed, that tragedy would continue to strike them in ways that defied rational explanation. They had also accepted that questioning these tragedies too closely might bring unwanted attention to their own families. The pattern that had emerged over 6 years was undeniable to anyone willing to see it. Every 2 years in September, a Winslow daughter would vanish on the eve of her wedding. The disappearances always occurred under impossible circumstances that suggested supernatural intervention rather than human agency. The investigations were always inconclusive, the evidence always insufficient, the explanations always unsatisfying. But the people of Millbrook had learned to live with mysteries they could not solve. They had learned to accept that some questions were too dangerous to ask, some truths too horrible to confront. They had learned to look away when looking too closely might reveal things they were not prepared to handle. This willful blindness would prove to be their greatest mistake. Anna Winslow was born in 1834, the daughter of Jeremiah's younger brother Matthew. When Elizabeth disappeared in 1851, Anna was 17 years old, the same age Sarah had been when her ordeal began. She had been raised in the shadow of her cousins' tragedies, but she had also been raised to understand that she was next in line to carry on the family name and traditions. Anna's engagement to William Thornton, a wealthy merchant from Springfield, was announced in the spring of 1853. The announcement was made with less fanfare than previous engagements, but it was clear that Jeremiah Winslow intended to continue the family traditions despite the tragedies that had befallen his own daughters. Anna, however, had learned from her cousin's experiences. She had spent years studying the patterns of their disappearances, looking for clues that might help her avoid the same fate. She had concluded that the key to survival lay in understanding the true nature of the curse that had claimed Sarah, Margaret, and Elizabeth. Her investigation led her to discoveries that previous investigators had missed or ignored. She found evidence that the Winslow family's prosperity was built on agreements that extended far beyond normal business contracts. She discovered that Jeremiah had been making payments to individuals and organizations that had no apparent connection to the textile industry. She learned that the mill's success was dependent on resources that seemed to have no identifiable source. Most significantly, Anna discovered that she was not the only young woman in the valley who had been experiencing strange dreams and episodes of disorientation. Similar symptoms had been reported by dozens of young women over the years, always in the months before their planned weddings, always ending with their mysterious disappearance or sudden death. Anna's investigation revealed that the Winslow family was at the center of a network of disappearances that extended throughout western Massachusetts. Young women from prominent families had been vanishing for decades, always under circumstances that defied explanation, always just before their weddings. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental, too widespread to be the work of a single predator. The truth, as Anna gradually pieced it together, was far more horrifying than anyone had imagined. The Winslow family had made a pact with forces that existed beyond the boundaries of normal human experience. In exchange for prosperity and power, They had agreed to provide regular offerings of young women at the moment of their greatest spiritual vulnerability, the transition from daughter to wife. The mill was not just a textile operation. It was a processing center for something far more valuable than cotton or wool. Hidden chambers beneath the production floor were not storage,
Diaries.
but preparation rooms where young women were transformed into something that could satisfy the appetites of entities that existed in the spaces between worlds. Anna's investigation was interrupted when she began experiencing the same symptoms that had preceded her cousin's disappearances: the dreams, the disorientation, the sense of being watched by invisible observers. She realized that her research had made her a target, that she was being prepared for the same fate that had befallen Sarah, Margaret, and Elizabeth. But Anna had advantages that her cousins had lacked. She had spent years studying the patterns of their disappearances, learning to recognize the signs of supernatural influence. She had developed techniques for maintaining her consciousness even when otherworldly forces were attempting to cloud her judgment. Most importantly, she had allies. William Thornton, Anna's fiancé, was not the passive victim that previous fiancés had been. He was an experienced businessman who had dealt with corruption and conspiracy in the commercial world.
Oh.
And he was prepared to apply those skills to understanding the supernatural conspiracy that threatened his future wife. Together, Anna and William developed a plan to break the cycle of disappearances by confronting the source of the curse directly. They would infiltrate the mill during the hours when its supernatural activities were most active, document the evidence of otherworldly involvement, and destroy the mechanisms that made the curse possible. The plan required careful timing and precise execution. Anna would allow herself to be drawn into the initial stages of the supernatural process, using her apparent cooperation to gain access to the hidden chambers beneath the mill. William would follow at a distance, prepared to intervene if the situation became too dangerous. On the night of September 12, 1853, Anna and William put their plan into action. The mill at midnight was a place transformed. The machinery that produced textiles during daylight hours had been reconfigured for purposes that had nothing to do with industrial production. The hidden chambers that Anna had discovered were filled with equipment that seemed designed to breach the boundaries between worlds, two open pathways that allowed entities from other dimensions to enter our reality. Anna found herself drawn into a procession of young women, all wearing wedding dresses, all moving with the mechanical precision of sleepwalkers. Some of these women Anna recognized as having disappeared years earlier. Others were strangers, presumably drawn from communities throughout the region. All of them had the same vacant expression, the same purposeful stride, the same complete absence of individual will. The procession led to the largest of the hidden chambers, a circular room with walls covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change when observed directly. In the center of the room stood Jeremiah Winslow, but he was no longer entirely human. His form had been altered by years of contact with otherworldly entities, stretched and distorted until he resembled a living conduit between dimensions. Around him stood figures that Anna's mind could not fully process. They appeared to be human in general outline, but their features were constantly shifting, as if they were wearing masks that could not quite maintain their shape. These entities radiated a cold that had nothing to do with temperature, a hunger that extended far beyond physical appetite. Anna realized that she was witnessing the culmination of a process that had been building for decades. The young women who had been disappearing were not. Anna felt her own consciousness being drawn into this network, her individual identity dissolving as she became part of something larger and more terrible than herself. She struggled to maintain her sense of self, to remember her purpose, but the pull of the collective was overwhelming. It was at this moment that William Thornton made his move. He had been watching the ceremony from a concealed position, documenting what he witnessed and waiting for the optimal moment to intervene. When he saw Anna beginning to lose herself in the supernatural network, he realized that immediate action was necessary. William had come prepared for a confrontation with otherworldly forces. He had researched methods of disrupting supernatural rituals, had armed himself with materials that were said to be effective against entities from other dimensions. Most importantly, he had brought fire, The chamber beneath the mill was filled with materials that were designed to facilitate contact with otherworldly entities. But these same materials were vulnerable to destruction by conventional means. William's torches, strategically placed throughout the room, began to consume the symbols on the walls. The ritual implements, the very foundations of the supernatural machinery. As the fire spread, the otherworldly entities began to lose their grip on our reality. The young women in wedding dresses started to regain their individual consciousness, breaking free from the network that had bound them together. The carefully maintained barriers between dimensions began to collapse, sending shockwaves through the supernatural infrastructure that had taken decades to construct. Jeremiah Winslow, caught between his human origins and his otherworldly transformation, began to disintegrate as the forces that had sustained him were disrupted. His final words, according to William's later testimony, were a warning that the destruction of the mill would not end the curse, that the entities would find other ways to satisfy their hunger. The fire that consumed the hidden chambers quickly spread to the mill itself. By dawn, the entire complex was reduced to ashes, taking with it the physical manifestations of the supernatural conspiracy that had claimed so many young women. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Of the dozens of young women who had been held in the supernatural network, only 7 survived the disruption process. The others, including Sarah, Margaret, and Elizabeth Winslow, had been too deeply integrated into the otherworldly system to maintain their individual existence when it was destroyed. Anna Winslow was among the survivors, but she was forever changed by her experience. She had seen things that no human mind was designed to process, had been connected to entities whose very existence challenged the fundamental assumptions of reality. She and William were married in a simple ceremony the following spring, but their relationship was overshadowed by the knowledge of what they had witnessed, the fear of what might still be lurking in the shadows. The official investigation into the mill fire was conducted by a team of investigators from Boston, brought in specifically because local authorities were considered too close to the situation to be objective. Their report filed in the state archives concluded that the fire had been caused by faulty equipment and that the casualties were the result of workers being trapped in the building during the overnight shift. This explanation ignored the fact that textile mills did not typically operate overnight shifts, that none of the alleged victims had been reported missing by their families, and that the equipment found in the ruins bore no resemblance to anything used in textile production, but it provided a comfortable fiction that allowed the state government to avoid confronting the implications of what had actually occurred. The survivors of the supernatural network were quietly relocated to other communities, their memories of the events carefully suppressed through a combination of medical treatment and psychological conditioning. They were given new identities, new families, new lives that had no connection to the horrors they had experienced. Most of them adjusted to their new circumstances, but a few continued to struggle with memories and dreams that they could not fully understand. Anna and William Thornton left Massachusetts immediately after their wedding, settling in California, where they established a successful import business. They had 3 children, all sons, and lived apparently normal lives. But Anna's private journals, discovered after her death in 1891, revealed that she had never stopped looking over her shoulder, never stopped expecting the otherworldly entities to return. The town of Millbrook was officially dissolved in 1870. Its remaining residents relocating to nearby communities. The mill site was purchased by the state and designated as a conservation area, but no development was ever permitted. The land remained barren, unable to support plant or animal life, as if the supernatural contamination had permanently altered the basic chemistry of the soil. The monument that stands there today was erected in 1875 by an anonymous donor, identified in court records only as a friend of the family. The inscription, "In memory of the daughters who never were," was reportedly chosen to honor not just the Winslow sisters, but all the young women who had been lost to the supernatural conspiracy. But the monument serves another purpose as well. Local residents have long believed that it acts as a warning, a reminder of the dangers that can arise when humans attempt to make bargains with forces beyond their understanding. The barren circle around its base is said to expand slightly each year, as if the otherworldly contamination is slowly spreading outward from its source. The records of the Winslow family disappearances were sealed by court order in 1876, officially to protect the privacy of the survivors, but more likely to prevent public panic about the supernatural conspiracy that had been uncovered. These records remain sealed today, available only to researchers who can demonstrate a legitimate academic interest, and who agree to strict limitations on what they can publish. But the story of the Winslow Curse has survived in other forms. Local folklore has preserved many of the details, passed down through generations of families who were somehow connected to the original events. Private journals, letters, and other documents have surfaced periodically, providing glimpses into the true nature of what occurred. And most significantly, the curse itself may not have been entirely destroyed. William Thornton's business records, examined by researchers in the 1950s, reveal that he continued to receive reports of similar supernatural activity in other locations. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, young women continued to disappear under mysterious circumstances, always just before their weddings, always in communities where textile mills or similar industrial operations had been established. These reports suggest that the entities that had made the original bargain with Jeremiah Winslow were not unique, that similar pacts had been made in other locations with other families. The destruction of the Millbrook Mill may have disrupted one node in a larger network of supernatural activity, but it did not eliminate the underlying threat. The investigation into these later disappearances was conducted by a private organization, established by William Thornton and funded by his business profits. This organization, known only as the Thornton Foundation, operated in secret for more than 50 years, tracking supernatural activity and attempting to disrupt otherworldly conspiracies before they could claim more victims. The Foundation's records, housed in a private archive in San Francisco, document hundreds of cases of supernatural activity throughout the United States and Europe. Many of these cases involved young women disappearing just before their weddings, suggesting that the pattern established in Millbrook was part of a much larger phenomenon. The Foundation's activities were curtailed during World War II, when its resources were redirected to more conventional intelligence work. After the war, the organization was dissolved, its records scattered among various private collectors and academic institutions. The knowledge and expertise that had been accumulated over decades of supernatural investigation was lost, leaving future generations vulnerable to the same threats that had claimed the Winslow sisters. Today, the site of the former Millbrook Mill remains a place of pilgrimage for those who study supernatural phenomena. Researchers and paranormal investigators visit regularly, hoping to find evidence of otherworldly activity or to understand the mechanisms that allowed the dimensional barriers to be breached, but the site yields few secrets to casual investigation. The supernatural contamination that prevents normal plant and animal life from thriving also seems to interfere with electronic equipment and recording devices. Photographs taken at the site often show unexplained distortions. Audio recordings The artifacts were studied by a team of anthropologists and archaeologists from Harvard University, but their origins and purpose remain mysterious. The symbols were unlike any known writing system. The artifacts were made from materials that could not be identified using conventional analysis techniques, and the overall design of the chambers suggested purposes that extended far beyond normal human activities. The most disturbing aspect of the discovery was the evidence that the chambers had been actively used for centuries before Jeremiah Winslow arrived in Millbrook. The stone walls bore traces of activities that had been conducted repeatedly over long periods of time, suggesting that the supernatural conspiracy had much deeper roots than anyone had previously realized. This discovery raised troubling questions about the true nature of American history, about the possibility that otherworldly influences had been shaping human events for far longer than most people were prepared to accept. It suggested that the Industrial Revolution, the westward expansion, and other major historical developments might have been guided by forces that existed beyond the boundaries of normal human experience. The Harvard research team's final report is classified by the federal government and never released to the public. It reportedly concluded that the United States had been built on a foundation of supernatural conspiracy, that the prosperity and power of the nation were dependent on maintaining agreements with otherworldly entities that demanded regular tribute in the form of human sacrifice. The implications of this conclusion were considered too dangerous for public consumption. The report was buried in classified archives. The research team was disbanded. The stone chambers beneath the mill site were sealed with concrete and steel. Official records indicate that the site was deemed geologically unstable and that access was restricted for public safety reasons. But the sealing of the chambers did not eliminate the supernatural activity at the site. If anything, it seems to have intensified the otherworldly presence, as if the entities that had once fed on human sacrifice were now trapped and growing increasingly desperate for sustenance. Local residents report that the area around the mill site has become a place of perpetual unease, where electronic devices malfunction, where animals refuse to venture, where sensitive individuals experience visions and auditory hallucinations. The barren circle around the monument has continued to expand, now encompassing nearly 10 acres of land that remains stubbornly lifeless despite decades of attempts at environmental restoration. More disturbing are the reports of young women in wedding dresses being seen in the area, always at night, always moving with the same purposeful stride that witnesses had described in the original accounts. These sightings have been reported by dozens of credible witnesses over the years, including police officers, park rangers, and academic researchers. The women in these sightings are described as being transparent or translucent, as if they exist only partially in our reality. They appear to be searching for something, moving through the ruins of the mill with an urgency that suggests unfinished business. Witnesses report that these figures emanate a cold that goes beyond mere temperature, a presence that fills observers with an overwhelming sense of dread and loss. These sightings have led some researchers to conclude that the young women were consumed by the supernatural network were not entirely destroyed when the mill was burned. Instead, they may have been trapped in a state between dimensions, unable to move on to whatever fate awaits the dead, but also unable to return to full existence in our world. The most detailed account of these supernatural encounters was provided by Dr. Margaret Whitfield, psychologist from the University of Massachusetts, who visited the site in 1974 as part of a study on the psychological effects of historical trauma on local communities. Dr. Whitfield's report, published in the Journal of Paranormal Studies, described her encounter with a figure that she identified as Sarah Winslow based on contemporary descriptions and daguerreotype photographs. According to Dr. Whitfield's account, Sarah appeared to be aware of her presence and attempted to communicate through a series of gestures and expressions. The encounter lasted approximately 15 minutes, during which Sarah seemed to be trying to convey information about the location of something hidden beneath the mill ruins. Following up on this apparent communication, Dr. Whitfield obtained permission to conduct a limited archaeological survey of the site. Her team discovered a series of metal boxes buried beneath the foundation stones, each containing personal items that had belonged to young women who had disappeared in the region during the 19th century. The items included jewelry, hair ribbons, pressed flowers, letters, and photographs. Each box was carefully labeled with a name and date, creating a catalog of victims that extended far beyond the known disappearances. The discovery suggested that the supernatural conspiracy had been claiming young women throughout western Massachusetts for decades, not just in Millbrook, but in dozens of communities throughout the region. Most significantly, the boxers contained detailed records of the rituals and ceremonies that had been used to breach the dimensional barriers. These records, written in multiple languages and using symbols that were consistent with those found in the stone chambers, provided a comprehensive guide to the supernatural practices that had made the otherworldly conspiracy possible. Dr. Whitfield's team also discovered evidence that the conspiracy had not been limited to the United States. Similar records were found that documented supernatural activity in England, France, Germany, and other European countries.
Patterns
were identical. Young women disappearing just before their weddings, industrial operations that served as covers for otherworldly activities, prominent families that had made pacts with entities from other dimensions. The scope of the conspiracy was far larger than anyone had previously imagined. It appeared to be a coordinated effort spanning multiple countries and centuries. suggesting that the otherworldly entities were operating according to a long-term plan that extended far beyond the events in Millbrook. Dr. Whitfield's research was interrupted when she began experiencing the same symptoms that had preceded the original disappearances. The dreams, the disorientation, the sense of being watched by invisible observers. She realized that her investigation had attracted the attention of the same entities that had claimed the Winslow sisters. And she immediately discontinued her research and left the area. But the damage had been done. Dr. Whitfield's discoveries had provided the otherworldly entities with new opportunities to influence our reality. The detailed records of supernatural practices had been studied and copied by other researchers, spreading the knowledge of dimensional manipulation to individuals who were not prepared to handle such dangerous information. Within months of Dr. Whitfield's departure, similar supernatural activity began to appear in other locations. Young women started disappearing under mysterious circumstances in communities throughout New England, always just before their weddings, always under conditions that defied rational explanation. These new disappearances followed the same pattern that had been established in Millbrook, but they were more widespread and more difficult to track. The entities seemed to have learned from their previous mistakes, establishing multiple nodes of activity that were less vulnerable to the kind of coordinated disruption that had destroyed the original mill. The federal government's response to these new disappearances was swift and decisive. A classified task force was established to investigate supernatural activity and to develop countermeasures against otherworldly entities. This task force, operating under the cover of various government agencies, began tracking the spread of supernatural conspiracies and attempting to disrupt them before they could claim more victims. The task force's activities were documented in classified reports that were not declassified until the 1990s, and even then, only in heavily redacted form. These reports reveal that the government had been aware of supernatural activity for decades, and had been actively working to suppress public knowledge of otherworldly entities. The task force's investigations confirmed that the supernatural conspiracy was far more extensive than anyone had realized. Similar patterns of disappearances were documented in dozens of countries, always involving young women, always connected to industrial operations, always requiring the cooperation of prominent local families. The entities behind these conspiracies appeared to be following a coordinated strategy designed to establish permanent beachheads in our reality. Each successful ritual created a small breach in the dimensional barriers, allowing more entities to cross over from their native dimension. Over time, these breaches would merge and expand, eventually allowing the entities to establish a permanent presence in our world. The ultimate goal of this strategy was not clear, but the task force's analysis suggested that the entities viewed our reality as a source of resources that they could not obtain in their native dimension. Human consciousness, particularly at moments of significant emotional. The task force's countermeasures were partially successful in disrupting the supernatural conspiracy, but they could not eliminate it entirely. The entities were too well established, too deeply integrated into human society, and too skilled at adapting to new circumstances. The best that could be achieved was containment, preventing the conspiracy from expanding beyond manageable levels. This containment strategy required ongoing vigilance and resources that the government was not prepared to commit indefinitely. By the 1980s, the task force had been scaled back significantly, its activities limited to monitoring known supernatural hotspots and responding to new incidents as they arose. The reduction in government oversight coincided with a resurgence of supernatural activity throughout the United States. The entities that had been suppressed for decades began to reassert themselves, establishing new nodes of activity in communities that had no historical connection to otherworldly conspiracies. These new incidents followed familiar patterns but with modern adaptations. Young women continued to disappear just before their weddings. But now the disappearances were facilitated by technology companies, financial institutions, and other contemporary equivalents of the industrial operations that had served as covers in the 19th century. The modern supernatural conspiracy was more sophisticated than its predecessors, using computer networks, social media, and other technological tools to identify and track potential victims. Now, the entities had learned to exploit the isolation and vulnerability of modern life, targeting young women who were already experiencing stress and uncertainty about their upcoming marriages. The most well-documented of these modern cases occurred in Silicon Valley in 1995, when 17 young women disappeared over the course of 6 months, all of them employees of technology companies, all of them engaged to be married. The disappearances were initially attributed to the high-stress environment of the tech industry, but investigators eventually uncovered evidence of supernatural activity similar to what had been documented in Millbrook. The investigation revealed that several major technology companies had been founded with capital from sources that could not be clearly identified, suggesting that the same otherworldly entities that had funded the original textile mills were now investing in modern industries. The company's offices contained hidden areas that were strikingly similar to the chambers found beneath the Millbrook Mill, equipped with technology that seemed designed to facilitate contact with otherworldly entities. The federal task force, that had been established to monitor supernatural activity, was hastily reconstituted to deal with the Silicon Valley incidents. Their investigation confirmed that the otherworldly entities had successfully adapted to the modern world, establishing new networks of influence that were potentially more dangerous than their 19th century predecessors. The task force's response to the Silicon Valley incidents was more aggressive than previous interventions. Rather than simply disrupting the supernatural activity, they attempted to trace the conspiracy to its source and eliminate the otherworldly entities entirely. This approach required the development of new technologies and techniques that pushed the boundaries of both science and supernatural knowledge. The operation, codenamed Dimensional Firewall, was launched in 1997 and involved coordinated strikes against suspected supernatural nodes throughout the United States and Europe. The goal was to disrupt the entity's ability to maintain their presence in our reality by destroying the infrastructure that supported their activities. The operation achieved mixed results. Many of the modern supernatural nodes were successfully disrupted, and the rate of mysterious disappearances decreased significantly. But the entities proved to be more resilient than expected, and within a few years, new nodes of activity began to appear in different locations. The entities had learned from the government's intervention and had developed new strategies for maintaining their presence in our reality. They became more decentralized, establishing smaller and more numerous nodes that were harder to detect and disrupt. They also became more subtle in their approach, avoiding the kind of dramatic disappearances that had attracted government attention in the past. Instead of targeting young women just before their weddings, the entities began to focus on other moments of spiritual vulnerability. They began to influence young women during other significant life transitions, graduations, career changes, the birth of children, the death of parents. These interventions were less dramatic, but potentially more widespread, affecting thousands of women who might never realize that their lives had been altered by otherworldly influence. The modern, supernatural conspiracy also began to target men. Recognizing that gender roles had changed significantly since the 19th century, young men experiencing their own moments of spiritual vulnerability became targets for a different kind of otherworldly influence, one that was designed to turn them into agents of the entities rather than direct sources of spiritual energy. These male agents, operating under the subtle influence of otherworldly entities, began to appear in positions of power and authority throughout society. They established businesses, ran for political office, and achieved prominence in academic and cultural institutions. Their influence was not dramatic or obvious, but it was pervasive, creating a network of otherworldly influence that extended throughout American society. The federal task force's attempts to monitor and counter this new form of supernatural influence were hampered by the entity's increased sophistication and the broader scope of their activities. The traditional methods of supernatural investigation were inadequate for tracking a conspiracy that operated through subtle influence rather than dramatic interventions. By the early 2000s, the task force had concluded that the otherworldly entities had successfully established a permanent presence in our reality. They could no longer be eliminated or contained. It could only be managed through ongoing vigilance and occasional interventions when their activities became too disruptive. This conclusion led to a fundamental shift in government policy toward supernatural activity, rather than attempting to eliminate otherworldly influence. The government began to focus on preventing it from causing major disruptions to society. The entities were allowed to continue their activities as long as they remained subtle and avoided attracting public attention. This policy of accommodation was controversial within the government, with some officials arguing that any compromise with otherworldly entities represented an unacceptable threat to human autonomy and dignity. But the practical realities of the situation made more aggressive approaches unfeasible. The entities had become too well established to be eliminated through conventional means. They had integrated themselves into the fundamental structures of modern society, establishing influence networks that extended throughout business, government, and culture. Any attempt to remove them would require disrupting these institutions to a degree that would cause more harm than benefit. The accommodation policy was implemented gradually over the course of several years, with the government establishing informal protocols for managing supernatural activity while maintaining the fiction that such activity did not exist. The Federal Task Force was officially disbanded in 2003. Its responsibilities transferred to other agencies operating under different mandates. The end of formal government oversight of supernatural activity did not eliminate the otherworldly entities' influence, but it did make their activities more difficult to track and understand. Without centralized monitoring and analysis, individual incidents of supernatural influence became isolated events rather than part of a recognizable pattern. This fragmentation of information made it increasingly difficult for researchers and investigators to understand the full scope of the entity's activities. The knowledge and expertise that had been accumulated over decades of government investigation was scattered among various agencies and individuals, much of it lost or forgotten. The result was that by the 2010s, the general public had even less awareness of otherworldly influence than they had possessed in the 19th century. The entities had achieved a level of integration into human society that made their presence virtually invisible to casual observation. But the entity's success in achieving invisibility did not eliminate their need for spiritual sustenance. They continued to feed on human consciousness at moments of vulnerability, but they had become more efficient in their harvesting techniques. Rather than requiring dramatic disappearances and supernatural rituals, they could now extract the spiritual energy they needed through subtle psychological manipulation. Young women experiencing major life transitions continued to be primary targets, but the entity's influence was now so subtle that most victims were never aware that they had been affected. They might experience unexplained anxiety, depression, or disorientation during important life events, but these symptoms were typically attributed to normal stress rather than supernatural influence. The entities had also learned to exploit the isolation and disconnection of modern life. Young women who were already struggling with social anxiety, relationship problems, or career uncertainty were particularly vulnerable to otherworldly influence. The entities could amplify these existing vulnerabilities, making their targets more susceptible to suggestion and manipulation. The most insidious aspect of the modern supernatural conspiracy was its ability to operate through seemingly benign institutions and activities. Social media platforms, dating apps, wellness programs, and other aspects of contemporary life became conduits for otherworldly influence. Young women seeking connection, meaning, or personal growth were unknowingly exposing themselves to entities that viewed them as sources of spiritual energy. The entity's influence extended beyond individual victims to broader social and cultural patterns. They began to shape fashion trends, entertainment preferences, and social norms in ways that made young women more vulnerable to their influence. The celebration of vulnerability and emotional transparency in modern culture, while having many positive aspects, also created opportunities for otherworldly entities to access and manipulate human consciousness. The cumulative effect of these influences was difficult to measure, but some researchers who were aware of the supernatural conspiracy began to notice concerning patterns in social and psychological data. Rates of anxiety and depression among young women increased significantly in the early 2000s, particularly during periods of major life transitions. The phenomena was typically attributed to social and economic pressures, but the timing and demographic patterns suggested that otherworldly influence might be a contributing factor. The entity's success in adapting to modern society was so complete that they no longer needed to rely on the kind of dramatic interventions that had characterized their activities in the 19th century. They had become a permanent part of the human experience, as integrated into daily life as technology, commerce, or government. This integration was so thorough that most people living in the early 21st century were unknowingly interacting with otherworldly entities on a regular basis. The entities had learned to disguise their influence so effectively that their presence felt natural and familiar rather than alien and threatening. The story of the Winslow Curse had become a historical curiosity rather than a warning about ongoing supernatural activity. The dramatic disappearances and supernatural rituals of the 19th century seemed like relics from a more primitive era, when otherworldly entities were forced to operate through crude and obvious methods. But the entities had not disappeared. They had simply evolved. They had learned to achieve their goals through subtle manipulation rather than dramatic intervention, through psychological influence rather than supernatural ritual. They had become more dangerous, not less, because their activities were now virtually undetectable. The monument in the former Millbrook site continued to serve as a reminder of the dangers of making bargains with otherworldly entities. Warning was largely ignored by a society that had forgotten how to recognize supernatural influence. The barren circle around the monument continued to expand, now encompassing nearly 20 acres of lifeless land. But most visitors attributed this phenomenon to environmental contamination rather than supernatural activity. The few researchers who were aware of the ongoing supernatural conspiracy continued to study the Millbrook site, hoping to find clues that might help them understand the entity's current activities. But the site revealed few secrets to modern investigation techniques, and the entities had become too sophisticated to leave obvious traces of their presence. The stone chambers beneath the mill ruins remained sealed, but sensitive individuals who visited the site reported that they could still feel the presence of the otherworldly entities. The barriers between dimensions remained thin in this location, creating opportunities for the entities to influence visitors in subtle ways that might not become apparent until years later. The most disturbing aspect of the modern supernatural conspiracy was its apparent permanence. The entities had achieved a level of integration into human society that made their influence virtually impossible to eliminate. They had become a permanent part of the human condition, as natural and inevitable as birth, death, and the passage of time. This permanence suggested that the entity's ultimate goal was not the destruction of human civilization, but its transformation into something that could serve their purposes more effectively. They were not invaders seeking to conquer our reality, but gardeners seeking to cultivate it into a form that could provide them with a more reliable source of spiritual sustenance. The implications of this realization were profound and disturbing. If the entities were successful in their long-term goals, humanity might gradually lose its essential nature without ever realizing what had been lost. The changes would be so gradual and so subtle that each generation would accept them as natural evolution rather than otherworldly manipulation. The story of the Winslow Curse, viewed from this perspective, was not a tale of supernatural horror that belonged to the past, but a warning about a future that was already beginning to unfold. The young women who had disappeared in the 19th century were not victims of a historical conspiracy, but pioneers in a transformation that would eventually affect all of humanity. The entities had learned patience. They had learned subtlety. They had learned to work within human systems rather than against them. They had achieved a level of success that their 19th century predecessors could never have imagined. They were just getting started. The barren circle around the monument in Millbrook continued to expand, year by year, acre by acre, as if the otherworldly contamination was slowly spreading outward from its source. Local authorities attributed this phenomenon to soil contamination. From the old mill, more knowledgeable observers recognized it as a sign that the entity's influence was literally growing stronger. The expansion was not random, but seemed to follow specific patterns that corresponded to ley lines, underground water sources, and other natural features that had been significant to the original supernatural conspiracy. The entities were rebuilding their influence network, using the Millbrook site as a base from which to extend their reach throughout the region. Young women living in communities within the expanding circle of influence began to report the same symptoms that had preceded the original disappearances. The dreams, the disorientation, the sense of being watched by invisible observers. But these symptoms were now so subtle and so widely dispersed that they were typically attributed to stress, anxiety, or other psychological factors. The entities had learned to harvest spiritual energy without requiring the dramatic disappearances that had characterized their earlier activities. They could now extract what they needed through psychological manipulation, leaving their victims alive but fundamentally changed. The young women affected by their influence might go on to live apparently normal lives, but they would never be quite the same. The cumulative effect of these subtle interventions was creating a generation of young women who were more vulnerable to otherworldly influence than their predecessors had been. Each successful manipulation made the next intervention easier, creating a cascade effect that was gradually transforming the fundamental nature of human consciousness. The entities were not just feeding on human spiritual energy. They were reshaping it to better serve their purposes. They were creating a new kind of human consciousness, one that was more open to otherworldly influence and less capable of independent thought and action. This transformation was so gradual that most people were unaware that it was happening. The changes seemed like natural evolution, the result of social and technological progress rather than supernatural manipulation. Only a few researchers who were aware of the entity's activities recognized the signs of what was actually occurring. The federal government's accommodation policy had effectively legitimized the entity's activities, making it impossible to mount any organized resistance to their influence. The entities were now free to pursue their long-term goals without fear of government intervention, as long as they avoided causing major disruptions to society. This freedom allowed the entities to accelerate their transformation of human consciousness. They no longer needed to work slowly and carefully to avoid detection. They could implement their plans more aggressively while maintaining the appearance of natural change. The result was that by the 2020s, the entities had achieved a level of influence over human society that surpassed anything they had accomplished in previous centuries. They had become integral to the functioning of modern civilization, their influence so pervasive that removing them would require dismantling the basic structures of contemporary life. The story of the Winslow Curse had become a prophecy fulfilled, a warning that had been ignored until it was too late to heed. The young women who had disappeared in the 19th century had been the first, victims of a transformation that was now nearing completion. The entities had won. They had achieved their ultimate goal of establishing permanent influence over human consciousness. They had transformed humanity into a species that could serve their purposes while believing itself to be free and autonomous. The monument in Millbrook still stands, its inscription still visible to those who know where to look. In memory of the daughters who never were, but the inscription now has a different meaning than it did when it was first carved. It is no longer a memorial to past victims, but a warning about future ones. The daughters who never were are all of us. We are the generation that has been shaped by otherworldly influence, the children of a transformation that began in the 19th century and is now reaching its conclusion. We are the final offering to entities that have been patient, enough to wait for the perfect moment to claim their prize. The barren circle around the monument continues to expand, and with it, the influence of the entities that call it home. They are no longer confined to the site of the old mill, or even to the valley where it once stood. They have spread throughout the region, throughout the country, throughout the world. They are everywhere now, and they are nowhere. They are part of the fabric of modern life, as natural and inevitable as electricity or running water. They are the hidden architects of contemporary civilization, the unseen gardeners who have cultivated humanity into the form they desired. The curse of the Winslow family has become the curse of all humanity. We are all daughters who will never be, sons who will never grow into the men we might have become. We are the harvest that the entities have been patiently tending for more than a century, and we don't even know it. The story ends where